to the country that they do call home. It's the right thing to do, and it will make America stronger. Mr. President, I ask consent that the following statement be placed in a separate part in the record.
Objection.
Mr. President, last week during the Senate recess, I traveled overseas to 4 countries: Ukraine, Turkey, Georgia, and Armenia. It's a lot of ground to cover in 5 days, 4 countries, in a region with considerable history and great challenging issues. Before I go any further on the matter, let me say, for the record, how impressed I am with the men and women who work representing the United States overseas, the ambassadors, all of their staff, the consular service, the military attachés, those working through the Department of Agriculture. They do us proud every day, and many of them make a personal sacrifice to represent our country. They are on the front line. Ambassador John Teft in Ukraine, Ambassador Richard Doney in Turkey, Ambassador Bass in Georgia, and Ambassador Heffern in Armenia. I want to thank them publicly for their public service. They are a reminder of why the relatively small amount of money we spend on diplomacy makes a big difference in the world. Mr. President, a visit through this region is a reminder of the legacy of the Soviet Union, the challenges facing countries like Ukraine, Georgia, and Armenia, trying to build independent and democratic nations. They inherited an environment that had been virtually destroyed by the Soviets, broken economies built on a failed Soviet model, and weak political and governing institutions. Sadly, these countries are not just trying to build modern nations, but they face increased pressure from Russia. Ukraine's a good example when it comes to the issue of energy. They continue, even though they face this pressure from Russia, to look west, to the European Union, to the United States and NATO. They long to be part of partnerships with the United States. We need to support that relationship, as well as the programs that help them transition away from the Soviet legacy. There isn't enough time to cover all the issues facing all the countries, but I want to mention a few. In Ukraine, there's been a troubling development recently that threatens to overshadow so much of the progress they've made. Specifically, this government, currently in control, has jailed former Prime Minister Yulia Tymoshenko over alleged wrongdoing regarding a contract for natural gas with Russia. Many people have read about her detention and her hunger strike. One need not agree with policy decisions of former politicians, and I am not here to judge whether that contract was sound or not. But what I can say is that in a democracy, one shouldn't make a practice of jailing political opponents. It kind of discourages people from running. Doing so has the bad taste of Lukashenko's dictatorship in neighboring Belarus, and I've seen that firsthand, where the day after his election, Lukashenko, the last dictator in Europe, jailed all of his political opponents. Talk about discouraging people running for office. As long as no criminal activity occurred in a democracy, voters should decide at the ballot box if they did or didn't like policy decisions of an elected official. I had a heartbreaking discussion with Yulia Tymoshenko's daughter, Eugenia, and was deeply troubled by some of the stories I heard about her mother's detention. I also had a helpful meeting, though, with Prime Minister Azarov and President Yanukovych on many issues of shared U.S. and Ukrainian cooperation, as well as the Tymoshenko detention. They assured me that they are going to move on a timely basis to deal with this detention, and I assured them that the West was watching closely. I hope that she will be released from her detention as quickly as possible. My second stop was in Turkey. I'd been there several times before. It's a growing power in the region and the world, a thriving Muslim democracy, and a strong NATO partner of the United States. Turkey most recently agreed to build an important NATO radar base on its soil, an installation that is absolutely critical in keeping an eye on Iran and its nuclear ambitions. This was a hard decision by Turkey to agree to this installation for NATO, and they made it, and I thank them for it because it makes the world a safer place. Turkey is also hosting on its border more than 20,000 refugees who fled the violence in Syria. I visited one of their refugee camps in Kilis. There were almost 10,000 refugees, 60% of them women and children. They were given a good, clean, safe place to stay and education for the kids, as well as health care. The Turkish government needs to be commended for the generous hospitality and kindness they provided to their Syrian neighbors fleeing Syrian President Assad's brutality. I just wondered if the United States would be as welcoming under those circumstances. Turkey has been, and they should be commended for it. I spoke with many of the Syrians who were in the camp. They told me stories that were deeply troubling about the violence that they faced and why they had to leave everything behind and move to a neighboring country. They worried about family and friends still there, particularly given the massacre reported last week in Hola. The international community must do more to end the violence and foster a representative transition to democracy in Syria. I have to note for the record that I saw my colleague John McCain on the floor today, and I know he and Senator Lieberman and others have been to the same place and met with refugees and have strong feelings about Syria. I have to say, and I've said this even to the Syrian opposition that I met with, I don't believe there's an appetite in America for invading another Muslim country or sending America's armies to a new place in the world. We are war-weary after more than 10 years at it. What we're looking for is an international organization or others who will join in the effort to stop the killing under Bashar al-Assad. We are encouraging, as Secretary Clinton did last week, for Russia to step up. It's always had a special relationship with Syria. If Russia can bring the various parties together in the violence and start a transition away from the bloody brutality of Bashar al-Assad, it'll be in the best interest of Russia and the world. And the Arab League needs to raise its voice about solving those problems. We can't let Assad bring any further embarrassment to the nations around the world. He's proven himself unworthy of support of Russia or any country. I'm urging Russia, the United States, Turkey, and others to find a timely way forward in Syria. Mr. President, my final stops were in Georgia and Armenia, two other friends of the United States. In Georgia, President Saakashvili has made great progress on democratic and economic reforms, and he really was a leader in the Rose Revolution. His term ends soon, and I hope the ensuing election and peaceful transfer of power will serve as a model for the region. We also should not forget one very important thing about Georgia. It is still dealing with the after effects of the 2008 war with Russia that resulted in breakaway republics in Abkhazia and South Ossetia. I visited the South Ossetian borderline. I saw the permanent Russian facilities there. It is clear that Putin is trying to create a provocative environment within Georgia today. We need to take steps to make sure that the EU six-point plan is worked out, a plan that was not implemented after the war. And I hope that the displaced persons and communities in South Ossetia and those in Abkhazia as well will have a chance to be reintegrated back into Georgia where they belong. We need to take the steps to eliminate and reduce unnecessary human suffering. The EU has an important monitoring mission there, and I urge both Russia and Georgia to work with them. One last point I want to make about Georgia is a lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Marine Corps who is stationed at Tbilisi in our embassy reported on what is a phenomenal thing going on. Georgia is not in NATO. President Obama has said they can be and will be, and they should be. But at this moment in time, Georgia is contributing more forces and soldiers per capita than any nation on earth to the NATO mission in Afghanistan. And the lieutenant colonel in our Marine Corps training these Georgian soldiers said they were great fighters. And he went on to say, and if you want to know how I can prove that, I'm sending them to Afghanistan to stand next to U.S. Marines and be there to help us in the fight. That's as great an endorsement as any Marine could ever give to another fighting soldier. Lastly, Armenia. There are so many Armenians across America who have made such a profound impact on our nation, in fact, around the world. The diaspora of Armenian citizens is larger than the current population of that nation. It is a nation that has lived through some terrible brutality and loss of life. The genocide that occurred at the beginning of the last century may have claimed as many as 1.5 million lives as Armenians were displaced from what is now eastern Turkey, many of them pushed into the deserts of Syria where they died. It is a legacy they remember, and I visited the Genocide Museum to acknowledge the great loss of life that Armenia has suffered. There was a special tribute there to Clara Barton, who may be remembered in American history for her work in establishing nursing and health care. She went on late in life in her 70s to Armenia to provide that same kind of assistance, and she's given special recognition in Yerevan, Armenia today. The Armenian Genocide Memorial and Museum pay tribute to many Armenians and the courageous leadership of those countries that went forward after their painful past. I called on President Gül of Turkey when I visited with him, as I did several years ago, to work closely with Armenia to try to resolve past differences, to make an honest acknowledgement of the history between the two countries, and to try to work out a peaceful and cooperative relationship. Mr. President, one encounter in Armenia in particular gave me hope that such a path forward is possible. I had the chance to meet with 6 Armenians who participated in a U.S.-supported program, a cross-border program with Turkey. Artists, journalists, business entrepreneurs, filmmakers, and high school students, and some of their stories were deeply moving. One young high school student named Victoria talked about the summer camp she visited in Vermont with Turkish high school counterparts, how they broke through some of the stereotypes and started friendships. A filmmaker talked about joint film programs made with her Turkish counterparts and then shown at an Istanbul Film Festival. And an entrepreneur in Armenia talked about a service he set up to help business people from Turkey work in Armenia and invest in that country. These stories gave me hope that some of the painful wounds between these countries can be healed. Mr. President, let me close by saying what a reminder these countries are of the importance still played by American leadership all over the world. At a time with so many economic and security challenges around the world, now is not the time for the United States to retreat from the global stage. I fully support the President's ending of the war in Iraq. I do believe that we should remove our troops from Afghanistan as quickly as possible, but I know that we have to remain engaged. The world still looks to us for leadership and values that they can build their own countries on and their future on as well. Mr. President, I yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Mr. President,
The Assistant Majority Leader.
ask consent the quorum call be suspended
Without objection.
and consent the Senate proceed to a period of morning business with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to consideration of calendar number 414S2061.
The clerk will report.
Calendar number 414S2061, a bill to provide an exchange of land between the Department of Homeland Security and the South Carolina State Ports Authority.
Is there objection to proceeding to the measure? Without objection, the Senate will proceed to the measure.
I ask unanimous consent the committee reported amendments be agreed to, the bill as amended be read a third time and passed, the motion to reconsider be laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate, and any related statements be printed on the record.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration on block of the following resolutions which were submitted earlier today: Senate Resolution 477, 478, 479, and 480.
Without objection, the Senate will proceed en bloc.
I ask consent the resolutions be agreed to, the preambles be agreed to, the motions to reconsider be laid upon the table en bloc with no intervening action or debate, and any statements related to the resolutions be printed in the record at the appropriate places if read.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent the Senate now proceed to the consideration of Senate Resolution 481 submitted earlier today.
The clerk will report.
Senate Resolution 481, celebrating the 60th anniversary of the United States-Philippines Mutual Defense Treaty and the vitality of the overall bilateral relationship.
Is there objection to proceeding to the measure? Without objection, the Senate will proceed.
Mr. President, I know of no further debate on the resolution, and I ask that you call for the yeas and nays. Pardon me? Ask that you call for a vote.
All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it.
I ask consent that the preamble be agreed to and the motion to reconsider be laid upon the table.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to consideration of Senate Concurrent Resolution 45 submitted earlier today.
The clerk will report.
Senate Concurrent Resolution 45, authorizing the use of Emancipation Hall in the Capitol Visitor Center for an event to award the Congressional Gold Medal collectively to the Montford Point Marines.
Is there objection to proceeding to the measure? Without objection, the Senate will proceed.
I ask consent the concurrent resolution be agreed to, the motion to reconsider be laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate, and any statements relating to the matter be placed in the record as if read.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent that when the Senate completes its business today, the Senate adjourn until 9:30 a.m. on Wednesday, June 6th, that following the prayer and pledge, the journal of proceedings be approved to date, the morning hour be deemed expired, and the time for the two leaders be reserved for their use later in the day, and the majority leader be recognized, that following the remarks of the majority leader and those of the Republican leader, the next hour be equally divided and controlled between the two leaders, with the Republicans controlling the first half and the majority controlling the final half.
Without objection.
It's majority leader's intention to resume consideration of the motion to proceed to Senate Bill 3240, the Farm Bill. We hope we can begin consideration of the bill during tomorrow's session, and if there's no further business to come before the Senate, I ask that it adjourn under the previous order.
The Senate stands adjourned until 9:30 a.m. tomorrow.